Hello, everyone. We all know the name Magellan, the textbook hero, the first man to circle the globe, a name synonymous with courage and discovery. But what if I told you that story, the one we all learned in school, is a carefully constructed fantasy? What if the real story wasn't about glory, but about a terrifying obsession? A story of a man who betrayed his country, led a fleet of mutineers into the unknown, and sailed his crew straight into the jaws of hell for a prize that wasn't even his to claim. Forget the heroic statues and the sanitized history books. Today, we sail with a ghost fleet into the heart of a dark legend to uncover the brutal, terrifying truth of the 99 days that broke the world. It begins not with a hero, Ferdinand Magellan, a brilliant Portuguese navigator, but a man with a chip on his shoulder the size of a mountain. He had served his king, bled for his country in the East, but felt perpetually undervalued, cast aside. He had a theory, an obsession really, that the legendary Spice Islands, the source of unimaginable wealth, could be reached by sailing west, a route that would belong to Portugal. He took this radical idea to his own king, Manuel I of Portugal, and was practically laughed out of the court. So Magellan did the unthinkable. He turned his back on his homeland, crossed the border, and offered his loyalty, his genius, and his secret route to the King of Spain. To the Portuguese, he was a traitor. To the Spanish, he was a means to an end, a foreign tool to shatter Portugal's monopoly on the Spanish king, a young Charles V, was intrigued. He gave Magellan his blessing, 5 ships, and a crew of over 200 men. But it was a poisoned gift. The ships were old, rotting hulks, barely seaworthy. The crew was a motley collection of sailors from across Europe. Desperate men, criminals, and most dangerously, Spanish captains who seethed with resentment. They were nobles, men of high standing, and they could not stomach the idea of serving under a Portuguese outcast. From the moment the Armada de Molucca left the port of Seville in 1519, it was not an expedition. It was a powder keg with a lit fuse. The air was thick with suspicion. Every order Magellan gave was questioned. Every glance from his Spanish captains, Juan de Cartagena, Gaspar de Quesada, Luis de Mendoza, was filled with contempt. They saw him not as their commander, but as their jailer, a foreigner leading them on a fool's errand. Magellan, for his part, was no easy man to serve. He was stern, secretive, and unyielding, a man who trusted no one, and for good reason. He kept his charts, his route, a closely guarded secret, feeding the paranoia that he was either incompetent or worse, secretly leading them to their doom on behalf of his former Portuguese masters. The fleet crawled down the coast of South America into a world unknown to Europeans. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. And still there was no sign of the mythical strait. The Paso that Magellan had promised the king would lead them to the Pacific. The crew's hope began to curdle into despair, and the captain's whispers grew louder, bolder. They cornered him in his cabin. Juan de Cartagena, the fleet's inspector general and captain of the largest ship, the San Antonio, was the ringleader. "Where are you taking us, Portuguese? Into the ice at the bottom of the world? Show us the charts. We have a right to know." Magellan's eyes were like chips of flint. He was outnumbered, a man without a country, commanding men who hated him, but he was not a man who bent. "I know where I am going," he declared, his voice cold as the Antarctic wind. "Follow me and ask no questions." That was his only answer. In the dead of a Patagonian night, in a desolate bay they named Port St. Julian, the Spanish captains made their move. They seized control of 3 of the 5 ships. Cartagena, Quesada, and Mendoza held the fleet hostage. They sent a message to Magellan's flagship: "The Trinidad, surrender your command, or we will open fire." This was the moment of truth. A lesser man. Magellan was surrounded, outgunned, his dream turning to ash. But inside this stoic, stubborn man was a core of pure, unyielding iron. He didn't panic. He plotted. He sent a small boat to one of the mutinous ships, the Victoria, under the pretense of negotiation. But the men in the boat were not diplomats. They were assassins. As Captain Mendoza read Magellan's letter, A dagger flashed, and he fell to the deck, his blood staining the wood in the chaos. Another of Magellan's ships, filled with loyal men, rammed the Victoria and retook it. One ship down. The odds were evening. Then Magellan turned his attention to the other two ships. He had his own cannons block the mouth of the bay. There was no escape, the mutineers. The rebellion collapsed as quickly as it had begun. Magellan's justice was as swift and merciless as his tactics. The bodies of the slain captains were quartered and displayed on gibbets as a gruesome warning to the rest of the crew. One captain, Quesada, was beheaded. Cartagena, perhaps because of his high rank, was spared the sword instead. He was sentenced to a fate arguably worse than death. He was to be marooned, left behind on the desolate, frozen coast of Patagonia with a rebel priest for company. The image is haunting: two men, once proud Spanish nobles, standing on an empty shore, watching the 5 ships that were their only link to the world become tiny specks on the horizon, leaving them to the ice, the silence, and a slow, certain death. The message was clear: there is only one command. Anyone who defies it will be erased. With the mutiny crushed and his authority sealed in blood, Magellan pushed his terrified crew onward, deeper into the unknown south. The cold was a physical entity, a monster that gnawed at their bones. Ice coated the rigging. Storms of unimaginable fury battered the old wooden ships. And then, finally, they saw it. A dark opening in the coastline. Was this it, the mythical strait? Or just another dead end? Another false hope? He sent 2 ships to investigate. Days passed. The fleet waited, tension hanging in the frigid air. A storm blew in, and the 2 ships vanished. Magellan must have felt his heart sink. Had he sacrificed so much only to lose his ships to the very passage he sought? Then on the horizon they reappeared. They had found it, a deep saltwater channel that cut through the landmass, the strait. But their joy was short. Lived the passage was not a simple channel. It was a treacherous, winding labyrinth of fjords and dead ends, a 350-mile maze of violent currents, sudden squalls, and towering cliffs that plunged into black, icy water. For 38 agonizing days, the largest ship, the San Antonio, carrying a huge portion of their remaining food supplies, lost its nerve. Its crew overpowered their captain, turned the ship around, and fled back into the Atlantic, bound for Spain, where they would brand Magellan a monster and a madman. When Magellan learned of their desertion, it was a devastating blow. He had lost his biggest ship and a third of his provisions. The remaining crew, they had found the strait. That was victory enough. Return to Spain a hero, they pleaded. Don't gamble our lives on what lies beyond. Magellan stood on the deck of the Trinidad, looking west. Before him lay the entrance to a new ocean, a body of water no European had ever sailed. It looked calm, peaceful, a stark contrast to the violent Atlantic. In that moment, he made the decision that he had staked his life, his honor, and the lives of all his men on this belief. To turn back now was to admit defeat, to admit the mutineers had been right. His pride, his iron will, would not allow it. He addressed his remaining men, his voice ringing with a conviction that bordered on fanaticism. "We are going on," he declared, "even if we have to eat the leather from the ship's rigging." None of them could have known it was a prophecy. On the 28th of November, 1520, the 3 remaining ships, the Trinidad, the Concepcion, and the Victoria, sailed out of the strait and into the vast unknown ocean. Magellan, struck by its placid beauty, named it Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea. It was the single greatest misnomer in the history of exploration. The winds were favorable, the sea was an endless shimmering blue, but the blue was the problem. It was empty, utterly, terrifyingly empty. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into a month. The imagined Spice Islands did not appear. All they saw was water, an infinite, featureless expanse of water and sky. The Pacific was not a small sea, it was a liquid continent, a body of water and they were running out of food first. The fresh provisions were gone. Then the salted meat. They were reduced to ship's biscuit, but the biscuit was no longer biscuit. It was a vile powder, riddled with rat droppings and swarming with worms. The chronicler of the voyage, a nobleman named Antonio Pigafetta, wrote that the crew had to hold the biscuits to their noses to endure the stench. But even this foul meal was a luxury. Soon, even the worm-eaten dust was gone. The men were starving. Their bodies began to waste away, their muscles atrophying, their minds, clouded by hunger, began to play tricks on them. They saw phantom islands on the horizon, only to have them dissolve into heat haze. Hope was the scarcest commodity on the fleet, and then the real horror began. They began to eat the rats. The ship's rats, once a pest, became a prized delicacy. A desperate hunt began in the dark, stinking holes of the ships. A man who caught a rat could sell it for half a gold ducat, a fortune. But there were never enough. The starving hunted the starving. When the last rat was caught and eaten, their eyes turned to the ship itself. They tore off the pieces of oxide leather that were wrapped around the main yard to prevent the rigging from chafing. This leather was hard as iron, baked by the sun, soaked in salt water, and coated in filth. They had to tow it behind the ship in the sea for 4 or 5 days just to soften it. Then they would place it over the embers of a fire, grill it, and try to chew it down. It was almost indigestible. They ate sawdust. They chewed on scraps of canvas. They became ghouls, skeletal figures with sunken eyes and hollow cheeks, driven by the single primal urge to find one more thing to eat. But a new enemy had come aboard, one more terrifying than starvation. It was a silent, insidious killer that came from within scurvy. Their bodies, deprived of vitamin C, began to disintegrate. They would swell up, turning a dark purplish color, growing so bloated that they covered the men's teeth entirely. They couldn't eat, even if there was food. Their teeth became loose and fell out. Then came the open sores, foul-smelling ulcers that erupted all over their bodies. Their joints swelled, filling them with excruciating pain. Old wounds, even those that had been healed for years, would suddenly break open and begin. The psychological toll was just as devastating. Men went mad. They would weep uncontrollably or stare into the endless blue for days without speaking. The peaceful seas had become their prison. Their tomb, 19 men died of this horrific disease. Their bodies were sewn into canvas sacks and dropped over the side, a brief splash in the infinite ocean. With each burial, a piece of the survivor's hope. He too was suffering, but he showed no weakness. He drove the ships on, his will of iron the only thing holding the expedition together. But was it leadership, or was it a monstrous suicidal pride? Had he led his men into the promised land, or was he the captain of a ghost ship, sailing a crew of the dead toward a destination that existed only in his mind? He consulted his charts, his just the sun, the sea, and the slow, agonizing march of death. One can only imagine the nights on those ships, the creak of the hull, the flap of the sails, and the soft, terrible groans of dying men in the darkness. Did Magellan sleep? Did he pace the deck of the Trinidad, staring at the stars that had guided him here, now mocking him with their cold indifference? Did he ever, for a moment, feel a shred of doubt? After 99 days of hell on the water, they saw it. It was not a phantom this time. It was real land. The island of Guam, the men who could still stand wept with relief. They had crossed the threshold of death and emerged on the other side. They anchored and were met by the local Chamorro people who swarmed their ships in canoes, bringing fresh food and water. For the starving crew, it was paradise. The Chamorros, who had their own concepts of community property, began taking items from the ship, including a small skiff Magellan. Interpreting this as theft, flew into a rage. He led an armed party ashore, burned down the natives' village, killed several men, and took back his boat. He named the island Isla de los Ladrones, the island of thieves. The encounter was a dark. From Guam they sailed on, their bodies slowly recovering, and finally they reached the islands that would one day be known as the Philippines. Here Magellan found what he had been looking for, people who could communicate with his Malay slave, Enrique. This was a monumental moment. Enrique was from the east. By traveling west, he had circled the globe and returned to a land where his language was understood. He had found a westward route to the Orient. He had succeeded where Columbus had failed. This should have been the triumphant conclusion to his journey. He could have loaded his ships with spices and returned to Spain the most celebrated man on earth. But Magellan's ambition was not satisfied. He wasn't just a navigator. He was a conqueror, a crusader. He saw the natives not just as trading partners, but as souls to be won for Christ and subjects to be claimed for the King of Spain. He befriended a local ruler, Raja Humabon of Cebu, and quickly converted him and thousands of his people to Christianity in a mass baptism. Magellan saw himself as a divine instrument. He had conquered the world's greatest ocean, and now he would conquer the hearts and minds of its. His success in Cebu inflated his ego to dangerous proportions. He began to believe he was invincible, protected by God himself. Raja Humabon told Magellan of a rival chieftain on the nearby island of Mactan, a man named Lapu-Lapu, who defied his authority and refused to bow to the Spanish king or their god. Magellan saw an opportunity to demonstrate his power. He would crush this insolent chieftain. It would be a simple matter. A show of European force, Raja Humabon offered to fight alongside him with thousands of his own warriors, but Magellan, in an act of supreme arrogance, refused. "My men and I will do this alone," he declared. "I want to show you the power of our weapons and our God." He decided to attack with a ridiculously small force. Just 60 men. His own officers begged him to reconsider. But Magellan's mind was made up. He had stared down mutiny, starvation, and the world's most terrifying ocean. What was one primitive chieftain to him? On the morning of the 27th of April, 1521, he waded ashore on the island of Mactan. His plan was to use the shock and awe of his ship's cannons to scatter the natives. But the shoreline was protected by coral reefs, forcing his. As Magellan and his men struggled through the shallow water, they saw Lapu-Lapu's forces waiting for them on the shore. It was not a small band of rebels. It was an army of over 1,000 warriors. They let out a deafening war cry and charged. The Spaniards were immediately swamped. Their heavy armor made them slow and clumsy in the water. The natives, agile and numerous, swarmed around them. The Spanish fired their muskets and crossbows, but the shots were largely ineffective against the natives' wooden shields. Magellan had expected them to break and run in terror. They did not. They fought with ferocious courage. A poisoned arrow struck Magellan in the leg. He stumbled, but fought on, a man possessed. He ordered his men to burn the natives' houses to create a diversion. But this only enraged the warriors further. They focused all their attention on the man they recognized as the leader. They pressed in, a tide of bodies and weapons. Magellan was a skilled fighter, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. A bamboo spear struck him in the face. He retaliated, thrusting his own lance into the attacker, but he couldn't retrieve it. He reached for his sword, but he couldn't draw it. As his arm had been wounded, the warriors saw their chance. They surged forward. A warrior slashed him on the leg with a large scimitar, and the great captain. General, the man who had bent the world to his will, fell face down in the shallow water. The Mactan warriors descended upon him, hacking and stabbing until he was dead. So died Ferdinand Magellan, not in a blaze of glory against the elements, but in a bloody, pointless skirmish on a foreign beach, killed by the very people he had sought to dominate. His arrogance had been his undoing. The man who conquered the Pacific was defeated by a meter of water and a stubborn chieftain. His surviving men, horrified, scrambled back to the ships, leaving their captain's body behind. Lapu-Lapu and his warriors refused to return it, keeping it as a trophy of their victory. The invincible Europeans had been defeated. The spell was broken. After Magellan's death, the expedition fell into chaos. The once friendly Raja Humabon, seeing the Spaniards were vulnerable, turned on them, poisoning and killing 24 more at a banquet. The survivors were a shattered remnant. There were now too few men to crew the 3 remaining ships. They made a grim decision. They burned the Concepcion, the ship that had been plagued by the most leaks and decay, and divided the remaining men between the Trinidad and the Victoria. They finally reached the Spice Islands, their original goal, and loaded the Victoria with a precious cargo of cloves. But their ordeal was far from over. The Trinidad attempted to sail back across the Pacific, but was battered by storms and eventually captured by the Portuguese. Her crew was imprisoned, and most of them died in captivity. Only one ship was left, the Victoria under the command of Juan Sebasti, Finel Cano, one of the very men who had mutinied against Magellan in Patagonia. The little ship embarked on the final, desperate leg of the journey. To avoid the Portuguese, Elcano chose a perilous route, sailing across the Indian Ocean and around Africa without making landfall. It was another voyage into hell. Starvation and scurvy returned. More men died. The ship was leaking. Its sails were in tatters. It was a ghost ship, crewed by skeletons. Finally, on the 6th of September, 1522, nearly three of the more than 240 men who had set out on 5 ships, only 18 returned on this one battered vessel. They were emaciated, wraith-like figures. When they stepped ashore, they could barely walk. They had done it. They had circumnavigated the globe. But the man whose vision had launched the expedition was not among them. His body lay in an unmarked grave on a distant island. The cargo of cloves on the Victoria was so valuable that it paid for the entire cost of the expedition and even turned a small profit. The world was forever changed. Magellan's voyage had proven the true, vast size of the earth and its oceans. It opened up new routes for trade and conquest, knitting the far corners of the world together in a way that had never been done before. But at what cost? What of the hundreds of men who perished? What of the men left to die on the frozen shores of Patagonia? Their stories are footnotes in the grand narrative of discovery. The story of Magellan is not a simple tale of heroism. It's a dark epic about the terrifying power of human ambition. Magellan was a visionary, a genius of navigation, a man of incredible courage and unbreakable will. But he was also arrogant, ruthless, and so consumed by his own quest for glory that he saw his crew not as men, but as fuel to be burned in the furnace of his own ambition. He gambled their lives on a belief, and while his belief turned out to be right, the price of that victory was almost total annihilation. He didn't circumnavigate the world. He died halfway. The first man to... The journey's completion was led by a mutineer. The story is a tapestry of irony and tragedy. The next time you see the name Magellan, remember the true story. Remember the 99 days of eating rats and leather. Remember the ghost fleet lost in the terrifying emptiness of the peaceful sea. Remember that behind every great name in history, behind every glorious achievement, lies a trail of blood, sacrifice, and uncomfortable... That is all for today's video. If you found this journey into the dark side of history compelling, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Your support helps us uncover more of these hidden stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.